Why the government's ready to order an American early warning system. The boss of the British rival hits back. Bradford City back home after the fire. And the ultimate way of wrapping it up for Christmas. Good evening. The GEC chairman and former cabinet minister Mr James Pryor is leading a direct challenge to the government tonight as the political row grows over a new early warning plane for the Royal Air Force. Mr Pryor says the Ministry of Defence has behaved inexplicably in not choosing the British GEC Nimrod plane. The ministry is letting it be known that most recent Nimrod test flights were failures. MPs of all parties are asking the government to confirm now whether the contract has gone to the American AWACS plane, made by Boeing and already used by NATO.
Not for the first time, Mr Pryor seems to have played a high-risk political hand which has gone wrong. For the result of his intervention is a counter-hand from sources close to Defence Minister George Younger. They and other sources at Westminster say that Mr Pryor has failed to realise that the Defence Secretary has been leaning over backwards to give Nimrod a fair crack of the whip, even to the extent of very public even-handedness in Brussels earlier this month.
What I can say is that it's quite clear that both of them do work. It's a question of how they work in relation to the cost that each of them would be.
And that phrase, how they work, has proved absolutely crucial, because despite the fact that the Defence Secretary flew in both the rival aircraft, here the Nimrod in mid-November, the Ministry of Defence was already building up a serious case against Nimrod on the basis of other test flights. For this flight, with Mr Younger on board, was one of the rare occasions when the radar system worked properly. ITN has learnt that of 15 test flights between August and October, only 5 produced proper sets of working data. And, according to a Defence Ministry source, the information from them, quote, made our hair stand on end. Mr Younger was not told of the full findings until last weekend, hence it suggested his Brussels comments about both systems working. And it wasn't until last Monday, after he'd grilled his advisers, that Mr Younger decided without reservation to go for the American AWACS system. But in an interview released tonight, Mr Pryor is still insisting that Nimrod works.
What the Cabinet has to do, very simply, is to decide whether or not there's a system that works. If there's a system that works, and George Younger has said that both systems work, then under those circumstances you choose the British system. What I'm worried about is whether or not the assessment that has been made gives a fair chance to show whether the British system works or not.
Well, there'll certainly be a row about all this in Parliament tomorrow, with MPs trying to force an immediate statement from the government, and with many questions about Mr Younger's Brussels statement, because there's considerable feeling on all sides of the House that to go for AWACS would be quite wrong.
If we support AWACS, we're writing off £1 billion of British investment and adding another £500 million to the bill. And the consequences in terms of jobs, research and development, future export potential are enormous for British industry.
The Secretary of State has confirmed that Nimrod works well as the AWACS, and I would have hoped they would have chosen Nimrod instead as a British homegrown system with wonderful technology and a marvellous scientific achievement.
The Liberal leader, David Steele, said today that the government cannot be allowed to scrap £900 million worth of investment in Nimrod. To do so, he said, would help reduce Britain to an assembly line nation. But there are also plenty of Conservative MPs more than ready to support a government decision for AWACS. And with some wavering ministers apparently now also supporting it, it looks very likely that there'll be a unanimous decision for AWACS in Cabinet on Thursday.
Mr James Pryor's claim that the assessment of his Nimrod system was unfair has amazed officials here at the Ministry of Defence. They maintain that the evidence damning the Nimrod system was quite conclusive, and that the choice they made to go for the American AWACS plane instead was one of the easiest decisions they've ever had to take. Following Mr Pryor's accusations, the Defence Ministry is likely to set out its criticisms of Nimrod in forthright terms when the decision to scrap it is announced later this week. The Boeing AWACS plane, that is in use both with the US Air Force and with NATO in Germany, was clearly superior, according to the experts that examined it. The technical verdict in favour of AWACS is said to have been unanimous. All that Nimrod still had going for it was its lower cost and the fact that its technology is British, qualities which would only count if the technical results came close, but they didn't. A ground-based radar was used to track airliners and RAF fighters to set a standard against which to judge the two radar planes. Ministry sources say the Nimrod could only track about half the targets the ground radar found, whereas the Boeing AWACS tracked them all and some others which the ground radar had missed. The committee that assessed the two planes was chaired by the government's chief scientific advisor. It consisted of Defence Ministry purchasing staff, RAF personnel and scientists from government research establishments. The other major factor in Boeing's favour is said to be its ease of adaptability to new developments. It's based on the Boeing 707 airliner and has ample room inside it for extra equipment. In contrast, the Nimrod is cramped. A development of the old Comet airliner is just enough room for the equipment and crew, but little space for new systems to be fitted. GEC insist their aircraft would meet the RAF specification by the time it entered service, but the Ministry was apparently unconvinced. Nearly £1 billion has already been spent in the hope that Nimrod's technical problems can be overcome. The Ministry now believes they can't be, and faces the problem of finding some other use for the 11 Nimrods it had allocated for this project.
On jobs, GEC's warned all along that up to 2,500 people could be made redundant, including some of the country's top specialists in electronics, if the order went to Boeing. And GEC said some of those specialists would inevitably find work abroad, taking their skills with them. GEC had also hoped to win up to £2 billion in export orders if the British government had bought Nimrod. From its vast headquarters in Seattle, Boeing's mounted an intensive lobbying campaign designed to show that British industry would gain from a deal with them. In August this year, Boeing announced agreement with 3 major British electronics companies, Plessey, Rakel and Ferranti. Boeing said that for every £100 the British government spent on AWACS, £130 worth of work would be given by Boeing to British companies. That, they said, would create or guarantee up to 5,000 jobs for 10 years. Today they had this to say about jobs lost at GEC.
I feel that if the people at GEC are talking about becoming unemployed, or those people that are working on Nimrod, they must be those type of people that have high-tech skills. I'm sure they won't have a problem finding a job.
Boeing says it is serious about bringing more work to Britain. It's just announced a £300 million deal with Rakel to supply battlefield communications equipment. GEC is highly sceptical of Boeing's offers of work, and GEC says the real cost to British industry of grounding Nimrod is that it could severely damage Britain's credibility as a country able to deliver in a crucial area of high technology.
In Pakistan, more than 50 people have been killed and 300 injured in clashes between rival ethnic groups on the streets of Karachi. Some reports said women and children were dragged from their homes and beaten to death. Hundreds of shops and houses have been burnt to the ground. Troops are being called in tonight to impose a curfew in the troubled areas of the city. The South African government has freed 2 Swiss citizens seized during raids into Swaziland last Friday. They're said to be unharmed. And in Cape Province, the authorities say a member of the black nationalist organisation, the ANC, was killed in a gun battle with police. In Nicaragua, the brother of an American congressman has been arrested on suspicion of spying. The Nicaraguan Foreign Minister, Miguel Descoto, said the man was captured inside an airbase carrying maps of possible military targets. Last month, the American pilot Eugene Hassenfuss was jailed for 30 years on spying charges. Here, Bradford City Football Club returned to its home ground today, a year and a half after it was devastated by the worst fire in British soccer history. But for many people, today's homecoming stirred only painful memories of the 56 people who died.
They'd played soccer here at Valley Parade for almost a century before the disaster which claimed 56 lives. Today, many of the fans who'd seen friends and family killed or injured stood in the new £2.5 million stand to remember. Among the guests today, Sir Oliver Popplewell, whose inquiry into the disaster brought stringent safety precautions here and at grounds nationwide. Despite their memories, for many victims, this was a day they'd long looked forward to.
We're all laying there badly injured after the first week, and we all said, when there's all the talk of going elsewhere, we must go back to Valley Parade, and we're happy to do that.
Fittingly, the return home brought a 2-1 victory for Bradford City in the closing minute of the game. But it won't mean an end to their problems. The club may still face a massive compensation claim from fire victims. But today, at least, those problems were forgotten. Robert Hall, ITN, at Valley Parade.
Cricket news, England lost 2 wickets in the last 10 minutes of play in the third test at Adelaide. At the end of the third day, they were 349 for 5, still 165 behind Australia's first innings total of 514 for 5 declared. The biggest ever load carried on a British road proved quite an obstacle for Sunday drivers in Cheshire today. It was a petrol regenerator weighing in at 900 tonnes and travelling at a cautious 1 mile an hour. It was making its way from Ellesmere Port to a petrol refinery 5 miles away. A motorway had to be closed and 120 lampposts removed to allow it to pass. Jams built up all round, due, of course, to the weight of traffic. Finally, this Christmas, Americans may not be throwing away the wrapping paper on their presents. It could be a lot more valuable than the gifts.
How about passing the buck this holiday season? Well, at Moss and Hoffman on famous Worth Avenue, the buck is passing in the form of wrapping paper. For $55, you can get an uncut sheet of 32 $1 bills wrapped around your present.
We suggest it as a unique way for the man who has everything. Well, he doesn't have this, so perhaps that's one way of showing him that, well, there's something you didn't quite have.
These gifts are being wrapped for a Tequesta man who says he couldn't resist the idea of having 2 gifts in one. And his wife is a collector. She collects all kinds of wrapping paper, but this year she'll have to change one thing.
My wife has a habit of collecting all of the wrappings from all presents and reusing them later on in the future. So I thought this is one time that she won't be able to do that.
The money fresh from the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing can be used as an investment and has also come in handy for store employees when the cash register runs out of bills.
Well, that wraps it up for us. That's all this weekend from the team at ITN. Good night.